He was just picking up his son from school, planning to grab dinner like always. But when the waitress leaned in to pour their water, his hand froze halfway to the napkin. Around her neck hung a silver pendant, his late wife's pendant, the same one buried with her. He didn't say a word, just stared. And the waitress. She looked nervous, like she recognized him first. If you've ever felt that some moments hold more weight than they show, stay with us. Like, subscribe, or leave a comment if this touches something in you. Downtown Brattleboro was already dressed in its winter hush. The town had a way of slowing down when the leaves vanished, as if everything was holding its breath. The warmth of Carter's Hearth Cafe stood in contrast, a golden-lit refuge where locals came to sip black coffee and pretend the world outside wasn't icing over. Inside, pine garlands curled along the wooden beams, and soft folk music floated above the quiet clink of mugs and silverware. Alexander Montgomery sat at a window table, dressed in a tailored charcoal coat, the collar still stiff from the train ride-in. Next to him, Tyler, 10 years old, small for his age, but with eyes that watched the world too carefully fidgeted with a sugar packet. The boy had asked to eat somewhere real, not hotel room service or whatever Manhattan considered food. Carter's was his pick. Alexander scrolled absently through work emails on his phone, replying in quick, clipped phrases, every so often. He glanced at Tyler, then back to the screen. He had learned to be present in pieces, 10 minutes of attention, followed by 20 of silence. Tyler, with his chin just barely reaching above the table, suddenly sat upright. His voice was quiet but urgent. "Dad, look, that necklace." Alexander looked up. At the counter, a woman leaned forward to refill the pot on the hot plate. She wore jeans, a faded gray sweater, and a green apron with the name Amelia stitched over the pocket. Her dark hair was pulled into a soft twist, one strand falling loose along her cheek. But none of that mattered. Not to Alexander. What did was the necklace. A silver crescent moon rested just below the hollow of her throat, even from across the room. The shape caught the light in a way he remembered too well. The slight bend on the edge, the single pale blue stone embedded in the center, he knew every detail. He had chosen it himself, 21 years ago, before proposing to Isabel. Alexander's breath left him. He reached for his phone, hands stiff. In the photo folder marked private, he opened the one image he hadn't touched in a decade. Isabel, holding baby Tyler in a sunlit room, her face soft with exhaustion and love. The pendant lay exactly where it did now. He zoomed in. Same scratch, same slight tilt. His hands curled around the phone, knuckles pale. He looked again at the woman behind the counter. Amelia. She was laughing with a customer, smiling in that practiced, polite way people do when they've smiled too much for too long. She didn't seem shaken, didn't seem lost. Just another waitress in a small-town cafe. But the necklace. Alexander stood up. He didn't say a word. His chair scraped back slightly too loud, drawing a glance from a couple at a nearby table. Tyler's eyes widened. Dad Alexander didn't answer. He moved quickly, leaving his coffee untouched, his coat half-buttoned, and his son frozen in place. The bell above the door gave a single chime as he stepped into the cold. Outside, he gripped the metal railing with both hands, his breath fogged in front of him. The world tilted in a way that felt both impossible and too real. He had buried Isabel 12 years ago, not with a body, but with the decision to stop looking, inside the cafe. Tyler pressed his nose against the window. He wasn't used to seeing his father leave a room like that. Not without warning, not without him. Amelia, now turning toward the window to wipe a table, caught the boy's gaze. Their eyes met for a second. She smiled softly, uncertain. And then her hand reached, almost absent-mindedly, to the pendant at her chest. She touched it like it had meaning, like it had always been hers. She didn't look back. But he knew something had changed. The Vermont hills were hushed beneath a thin veil of early snow, the kind that didn't quite settle, but whispered the promise of winter. Alexander drove in silence, the engine of his rental car a steady hum against the tension crawling up his spine. Outside the windshield, Old motels and shuttered gas stations blinked past under the glow of flickering streetlights. The roads curved gently through the trees, and each turn felt like it should lead somewhere that made sense, but none did. Inside the car, his phone lit up again. Tyler. Another message. He didn't need to open it. He already knew the rhythm: worry, confusion, hope. He gripped the wheel tighter. His son had seen it too. The necklace. The unmistakable crescent moon with its worn edges and pale center stone. The one Isabel had worn nearly every day of their marriage. She hadn't taken it off, even when giving birth to Tyler. It had been a part of her, like the quiet way she hummed when folding laundry, or the way she whispered goodnight after tucking him in. And now, 12 years later, that same necklace rested on the collarbone of a waitress named Amelia in a town too quiet to be coincidence. Alexander pulled into a rest stop just outside Putney. The place was empty, the vending machines glowing with unnatural brightness against the dark. He parked, cut the engine, and sat. Then, slowly, he leaned forward and pressed his forehead to the steering wheel. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to do. His breathing turned shallow. The thought that Isabel might be alive should have lit a spark inside him. Instead, it left him hollow, because if she had survived, if she had truly been alive all this time, why hadn't she come back? Was it him? The guilt clung to him like frost on the windshield. He had searched for months after the accident: private investigators, search teams, interviews. No trace. Eventually, even the most dedicated team stopped calling. He remembered the moment he stopped asking questions, too. It had been raining. Tyler had a fever. Life had demanded something quieter, something manageable. Now, life was demanding something else. The phone buzzed again. Alexander picked it up this time. 3 unread messages from Tyler, each shorter than the last. "Where are you? Are you okay? Was that Mom's necklace?" He stared at the screen until it went dark. Then, with a tight jaw, he pulled up a contact he hadn't used in almost 5 years. Peter Langford, a man with the kind of instincts that didn't come from textbooks or police academies. He had a talent for finding people who didn't want to be found and, more importantly, for reading between the lines others missed. Alexander tapped the call icon. It rang twice. Langford. The voice on the other end rasped, a mix of gravel and fatigue. "It's me," Alexander said. A pause, then a quiet, almost reluctant reply. "Been a while. I'm in Vermont," Alexander said, "and I think I just saw Isabel." That silence again, heavier this time, where Langford asked, "Brattleboro, a small place called Carter's Hearth Cafe. There's a woman there. She looks like her, same build, same eyes. And Peter, she's wearing Isabel's necklace." Langford was quiet for a long moment. "You sure it wasn't just someone who picked it up at a pawn shop?" No, Alexander said, voice low. "I designed it, had it made. There's a scratch on the back upper edge of the crescent. It's there." Another pause. "I'll get in tonight," Langford said. "Don't talk to her. Not yet." "Let me look." Alexander closed his eyes, phone still to his ear. "Thank you." They ended the call without ceremony. Outside, the trees swayed slightly in the wind. Alexander sat there for several more minutes, trying to piece his world back together, but it wouldn't hold. Not yet. When he finally drove back toward town, his headlights cut through the quiet roads like a blade. At the cafe, the last of the customers were leaving. Tyler sat on the edge of a booth, a cup of cocoa in front of him, mostly untouched. He looked smaller than usual, hunched in his coat, watching the door with a face that held more patience than any child should have to learn. Inside, Amelia stood behind the counter, wiping down surfaces with quiet efficiency. She hadn't noticed the boy was alone until one of the older customers pointed it out. "Kid's been here a while. Is his dad coming back?" Amelia glanced toward the window, her eyes briefly catching Tyler's. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she stepped around the counter, knelt beside him, and spoke gently. Is your dad okay? Tyler looked up, his mouth opened slightly, as if trying to say something he wasn't sure he should. Then he shook his head. I don't know. She didn't ask anything else, just sat there for a few seconds longer, as if unsure why his eyes felt familiar. Back in the car, Alexander didn't know what he'd say when he saw Tyler again, but he knew he couldn't avoid the question much longer. He turned off the ignition and sat in the dark, watching his own reflection in the window, wondering what part of himself he might be about to meet again. The morning in Brattleboro had begun like most others, with the chime of the bell above the cafe door and the scent of cinnamon muffins warming in the oven. Amelia Carter stood behind the counter at Carter's hearth, wiping down the butcher block surface with steady, practiced movements. Her apron, green and faded, hung neatly from her waist, and the embroidered name above her chest, Amelia looked as much a part of her as the light lines around her eyes. Locals trickled in old men who ordered the same black coffee, middle-aged women in knit hats coming from yoga class, a pair of electricians needing breakfast before the next job. Amelia greeted each with the same warm rhythm. Smile, menu, refill on that, like clockwork. Her feet moved, her hands poured, her voice hummed, but inside, something had cracked. Her thoughts circled back to the night before the man in the gray coat, his face suddenly drained of color, and the boy beside him pointing at her necklace. Not at her. At the necklace. She hadn't worn it to be noticed. It was just always there, a habit, a quiet kind of comfort. She had it on when she woke up in Brattleboro Memorial Hospital all those years ago, bruised and disoriented, with no wallet, no name, just a chipped fingernail and that silver crescent moon around her neck. The nurses said a trucker had pulled her from the wreck in Green Mountains, that she was lucky to be alive. No ID, no memory, just that necklace. She reached for it now, fingers brushing the curve of the silver. It was smooth, familiar. But last night, when the boy pointed, something unfamiliar passed through her. Not fear exactly, something more complicated, like a memory trying to surface from a fog it no longer belonged to. A coffee mug clinked too loud behind her. Amelia blinked, grounding herself. She moved to the register, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a small wooden box the size of a paperback. It had belonged to her since those first weeks after the accident. Inside were the few remnants she hadn't thrown away. A torn bus ticket from White River Junction, a photo, grainy and faded, of a baby girl in someone's arms, the background blurred, and a note. The ink bled at the edges from years of weathered handling. Written on it, a single word and a question mark, Isabel. She didn't know why she'd kept it. The nurses had said the name might have been hers. One had scribbled it on a form after overhearing her mumble something in her sleep. The name stuck, not in her identity, but in her drawer. She stared at the note now, fingers hesitating just above the edge. The handwriting wasn't hers. She knew that much. Are you okay? Mom. The voice broke her trance. Zoe. Amelia's heart gave a small, involuntary skip. She snapped the box closed, tucking it back into the drawer before turning to face her daughter. Zoe stood there with one hand on the edge of the counter, her backpack still slung over one shoulder, 16, sharp-eyed, and already carrying the silent weight of someone who'd learned not to ask questions too quickly. She had Amelia's chin, but not her voice. That, they always joked, must have come from the wind. I'm fine, Amelia said, forcing a smile. Just tired. Zoe didn't look convinced, but she nodded. You want me to grab you anything from the store after school? No. Honey, we're okay on everything. There was a pause too short to matter, too long not to notice, before Zoe gave a small shrug and headed toward the back, the soles of her boots thudding against the wood floor. Amelia stayed at the counter. She didn't move, not at first. That necklace, that man's face, that boy's eyes. They had pulled something from deep inside her, something she couldn't name, but hadn't felt in years. She picked up a towel, dried a clean mug that didn't need drying, and stared out the front window. The sidewalk beyond was damp from melted frost. Across the street, a bus idled near the intersection. For a second, she imagined herself boarding that bus. No name, no cafe, no drawer full of questions. Just motion, away from the things that might chase her if she stayed. But she didn't move. Behind her, the door to the back room closed softly. Amelia stood there alone, hands still, the necklace cool against her skin, as if waiting for her to remember who she had been before it all disappeared. The hallway outside Langford Investigations still smelled faintly of varnished wood and old paper. On the door, the etched glass pane hadn't been updated in years. Peter Langford, missing persons. By referral only, inside. The office looked like a leftover from another decade, file boxes stacked unevenly in one corner. Framed commendations hung slightly crooked, and a well-worn coat hung on the rack by the window that faced the Brooklyn skyline. Peter Langford sat at his desk, the phone pressed to his ear, his brow furrowed. The moment he hung up with Alexander, he reached into the second drawer, fingers moving past a half-empty pack of cigarettes and a photo of his daughter, until he found what he was looking for, a faded brown folder marked IM MVT 2011, the Isabel Montgomery case. He hadn't touched it in nearly a decade. He flipped it open, photocopies of newspaper clippings, GPS data logs, initial police reports. A photo of Isabel from her missing persons flyer stared back up at him, soft features caught mid-smile, her hair pinned behind one ear, the necklace visible against her blouse. He had always remembered that detail. He had asked about it when he first interviewed Alexander. The necklace had been custom-made, unique, unduplicated. But 12 years had gone by, and even a detail like that could vanish into rumor. Still, Peter didn't believe in coincidence. He lifted the receiver again and dialed a number from memory. It rang 4 times before a tired voice answered. Nora Halprin speaking. Nora, it's Peter Langford. He said, Brooklyn, you got a second? A pause. Then the tone changed, warmer, but wary. Langford, Lord, it's been what? Since that runaway kid from Shroon Lake? Yeah, about 6 years. He leaned back in his chair. I need to ask you something. Nora, back in 2011 around April, did a Jane Doe ever come through Brattleboro Memorial late 20s? Female. Trauma from a vehicle accident. No ID. Necklace shaped like a crescent moon. There was silence on the line, then a slow intake of breath. We did, she said. I remember because I was the one who signed her in. Peter leaned forward. What do you remember about her? She barely made it, Nora said. Head injury, broken ribs. She was found by a truck driver guy never left his name. Said he pulled her from the side of Route 9. She didn't speak for days. When she did, she gave nothing useful, not even her name. But she had that necklace on her. I remember it clearly. Silver, unique. Peter tapped his pen against the desk. Was her file ever entered into the federal database? No. She didn't have a social security number, and no one filed a formal missing persons report connected to her physical description. Admin flagged it as a local-only recovery case. Once she could walk, she left. Peter's jaw tensed. So you're telling me you had a woman, no name, no records, wearing a necklace tied to one of the most publicized missing person cases that year, and no one followed up? She wouldn't let anyone, Nora said quietly. She didn't want to be found. Not then. Peter didn't speak for a moment. Do you have anything left from that file, he asked. Just a copy in my old notebooks. I'll dig it out. Send it. Priority. He gave her the office address and thanked her before ending the call. The room was quiet again. Peter sat there, the hum of the radiator, the only sound behind him. He opened Isabel's file again, this time pulling out the last page, his own notes. Scribbled in the corner was a sentence from an interview with a volunteer at the Green Mountains crash site, no confirmed body. She might have made it out. One of the nurses said she was talking in her sleep something about Tyler. He read the name twice, then a third time, Tyler. The kid. Peter stood, grabbed his coat, and stepped toward the window, looking down over Brooklyn, somewhere in Vermont. A woman with a borrowed name was wearing a necklace she hadn't bought. Somewhere else. A child was staring at her like he'd seen a ghost. He picked up his phone again and texted Alexander 2 words. I'm coming. The air at Green Mountains. Rest Stop still carried the cold weight of everything that had happened there 12 years ago. Frost clung to the wood railing that lined the overlook, and the early morning fog slid between the pine trees, like a memory trying to disappear. Alexander stood with both hands in his coat pockets, the collar turned up against the wind. He had arrived first. He always did. Peter Langford's black Ford Taurus pulled up slow and steady, tires crunching over gravel. The car door opened with a groan, and the man who stepped out looked exactly as Alexander remembered graying, sharp-eyed, the kind of man who carried quiet with him the way others carried weapons. Morning, Peter said, voice rough from the road. Alexander didn't return the greeting. He simply held out the photograph he'd brought with him, Isabel, holding newborn Tyler in her arms, the sunlight hitting her shoulder just right, the silver necklace glinting at her collarbone. Peter took the photo, held it at a slight angle against the light, and nodded once. Same pendant she was wearing when they brought her in. Nora confirmed it, even mentioned the engraving. Alexander turned slightly, watching the trees instead of Peter. She couldn't have known about the engraving. No one did. Exactly, Peter said. He handed over the printed hospital notes Nora had scanned to him before sunrise. The document, worn from age even in digital format, listed no name for the patient. It had a brief description of injuries, a mention of recovery, and this line, crescent-shaped silver necklace, engraved initials I.M. Alexander took the paper with both hands, his jaw tightening as he read. It was like looking through a crack in a sealed room. I never told anyone about the engraving, he said, quietly, not even the police. Peter gave a small nod. Then we're not chasing ghosts anymore. They stood in silence. Below the overlook, the old highway curved along the base of the hills. Somewhere along that road, years ago, a woman with no name had been pulled from the wreckage of her life and brought into another one without memory, one where the people who loved her didn't know where to look. She could have called, Alexander said, the words breaking out before he could stop them. If she remembered, if she knew who she was, she could have called. Peter didn't answer right away. He turned toward the railing, looked down the slope like he could still see the crash site. Sometimes people remember pain before they remember names, he said, and sometimes they remember enough to be afraid. Alexander said nothing. He folded the paper once, then again, like pressing the truth into a shape he could carry. She had a daughter with her. Peter added. Alexander looked up. A daughter, she calls her Zoe. No birth record I can find that matches, but the kid's about 16. Not biologically Amelia's, but close. Alexander's expression shifted, but it was hard to name what passed across his face. Surprise, fear. Something heavier. Peter didn't push it. Instead, he placed a firm hand on Alexander's shoulder. If Amelia Carter is who I think she is, this whole story isn't over. But if she's not, someone still tried to erase who she used to be. A truck passed behind them on the highway, the rumble deep and low. They stood there a few minutes longer, the wind lifting pine needles along the path behind the rest stop. Then Peter turned toward his car. I'll talk to her. You need to stay back for now. If we push too fast, she might disappear again. Alexander nodded once. His voice, when it came, was flat. I won't lose her twice. Neither man noticed the SUV parked across the road under a thicket of leafless trees. The gray vehicle sat quietly, engine off, windows tinted. Inside, a woman sat behind the wheel, tapping slowly on a tablet. Her hair was pulled tight. Her dark glasses reflected the men at the overlook, and her Bluetooth headset blinked with a steady blue light. On the screen in front of her, a file had been opened, a profile photo of Peter Langford. Below that, 2 words in bold red, active again. Her fingers hovered, then resumed typing. Victoria Sinclair didn't believe in coincidences, especially not when ghosts from a decade ago started talking again. The Montgomery real estate headquarters in Midtown Manhattan had a kind of silence that didn't belong to most office buildings. It wasn't the hush of a late Friday or the stillness after closing. It was something heavier, like a place holding its breath, the kind of silence that clung to legacy and secrets. Tyler pushed open the office door without knocking. The room was dim, the blinds half closed against the morning sun. He'd been in this office many times before, but never alone. Alexander wasn't there. Just his coat folded over the back of the leather chair and a thick manila file resting near the edge of the desk, its top flap unsealed. Tyler hesitated, then walked in. The file wasn't labeled, just a heavy rubber band holding the edges in place. He looked at it, then at the chair, then back at the door. He reached for it. As he pulled it closer, the band slipped off, and the papers inside fanned out. Some clattered onto the floor, copies of medical notes, grainy printed screenshots, hand-scribbled observations. Then one loose sheet fluttered further than the others, gliding beneath the desk like it had somewhere to be. Tyler crouched and reached for it. His fingers stopped halfway. The photo was old, but not ancient edges frayed, colors slightly faded. It showed a woman standing in front of a small-town bakery, her arm wrapped around a little girl. The storefront behind her was painted forest green, and the sign read, Carter's Hearth Cafe, Est, 1979. The woman in the picture looked like his mother. Not in the vague, wishful way that dreams can resemble memory, but exactly her jawline, her smile, the tilt of her head. And there it was, the necklace, the crescent moon. She was wearing it, clear as daylight, and the photo had a date printed in the corner just 3 months ago. Tyler's hand closed around the picture. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He just stared. The door opened behind him. Alexander stepped in, phone still in hand, mid-conversation. When he saw Tyler, his voice dropped. He ended the call without a word. Tyler stood slowly, the picture held in both hands like it might shatter. Alexander didn't speak. He saw the photo, the way his son held it, the way he looked at it, like the world had tilted beneath him. "Why didn't you tell me?" Tyler asked. His voice wasn't loud. That's what made it worse. Alexander stepped forward, hand out as if to take the picture back, but Tyler didn't let go. "You've been looking," the boy said. "You found her, or you think you did, and you didn't tell me." "It's not that simple," Alexander said. "Yes, it is," Tyler replied, his voice suddenly steady. "It's exactly that simple." Alexander looked down, then away. He rubbed his temples like trying to press back a headache that had lasted years. "I didn't want to give you hope for something that might not be real. I couldn't risk hurting you like that." Tyler stepped forward, holding up the picture. "This is real. That's her. That's Mom." Alexander took the photo, stared at it for a long moment, then lowered it without argument. He had no answers left to give, only the weight of what he hadn't said. If there's even a chance she's alive. Tyler paused, emotion catching in his throat. "I want to know her." The boy didn't wait for permission. He walked past his father and left the room, the echo of his footsteps softer than the silence he left behind. Alexander looked down at the photo again, then out the window toward the skyline. Some things don't go away. They just wait until you're forced to look them in the eye. Carter's Hearth Cafe had long gone quiet for the night. The chairs were flipped atop tables, the lights dimmed to soft amber glow, and only the ticking wall clock and faint hum of the refrigerator remained. Outside, Main Street in Brattleboro was silent under the pale light of street lamps. Zoe Carter moved through the cafe with quiet, practiced steps, her boots barely making a sound on the old wooden floors. She had forgotten her English assignment behind the counter earlier. That's all she came back for, or so she told herself. 16 was a strange age, old enough to notice when someone was hiding something, but too young to ask and expect answers. Zoe had learned to read silences, to catch pauses in conversation, and lately, her mother had been full of them. She crouched behind the counter, reaching for the binder where she kept her schoolwork wedged between the coffee filters and spare order pads. As she stood back up, she noticed the drawer below the register, normally locked, wasn't latched shut. Zoe froze. That drawer had always been off limits. Amelia never said so out loud, but the way her hand hovered protectively over it, the way she slid it shut, even when Zoe wasn't looking directly at it, it carried weight. Tonight, it had been left slightly ajar. Zoe glanced toward the hallway. Amelia had already gone upstairs. The stairs creaked if you moved too fast, and her mother was a light sleeper. Still, the drawer pulled at her curiosity like gravity. She reached for the handle and eased it open. Inside, beneath receipts and loose change, was a small wooden box, old, smooth with age, and locked with a tiny brass clasp already unhooked. Zoe hesitated again, then slowly lifted the lid. A folded piece of paper lay on top, edges curled, the ink faint from water damage. She opened it carefully. If you forget, they win. Zoe blinked. The handwriting wasn't her mother's, not the sharp slant of her grocery lists, or the round loops she used when leaving notes on the fridge. This writing was hesitant, messy, desperate. She lifted the note, and underneath, there was a black and white photo. A woman stood in the picture, wearing a long coat and scarf, her arms wrapped around a bundled newborn. Her face was delicate, thoughtful, but not unfamiliar. Zoe leaned closer. The resemblance was uncomfortable. The woman looked like Amelia, but not quite. Her eyes seemed sharper, her posture straighter, like someone who had once known exactly who she was. And the child in her arms had a small fist pressed against her collarbone, resting just below a silver crescent pendant. Zoe felt her chest tighten. She flipped the photo over. Nothing written. Just a faint smear of something like oil on one corner, like it had been handled too often, too fast. A floorboard creaked overhead. Zoe snapped the box shut, shoved it back into the drawer, and closed it quickly, but not before the folded note slipped from her fingers, falling to the floor beside the cabinet. She didn't notice. Her heart was beating too fast. She hurried into the hallway, her school binder forgotten, and rushed up the stairs 2 at a time. Back in her room, the door closed with a soft click. She dropped to her desk and opened her laptop, fingers shaky as she typed. She didn't know why she searched it. Maybe the name had been stuck in the note. Maybe she'd heard it whispered under her mother's breath years ago, but it came to her all the same. Isabel Montgomery. She hit enter. A list of search results loaded slowly: news clippings, archived missing person reports, an old real estate fundraiser dated 2012 with Alexander Montgomery's name on the banner. Zoe scrolled, then stopped. There it was, a photo from the missing person flyer, Isabel Montgomery, last seen in 2011 Vermont. Crescent necklace, same tilt of the chin, the same eyes Zoe saw every morning in the mirror. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she wasn't supposed to exist in the way she'd always believed she had. She stared at the screen, the soft hum of the laptop fan barely covering the tremor in her breath. She didn't look back, but something inside her had already turned. The morning light fell softly through the frosted windows of Carter's Hearth Cafe, casting muted streaks of gold across the worn wooden floor. The place was just opening quiet, the way small-town cafes always were before the regulars arrived. Amelia Carter had already set the tables, prepped the pastry case, and adjusted the thermostat twice, though the heat had been working fine. Then the bell above the front door rang. She looked up, hands still gripping the back of a chair. Alexander Montgomery walked in, not alone this time. The man beside him was older, broader in the shoulders, his steps slower, but focused like he'd spent a lifetime entering rooms where people didn't want him. Amelia didn't blink, but something behind her eyes did. She steadied her breath and walked over. "Good morning," she said, voice even. "Practiced?" Same table. Alexander gave a faint nod. She set the menus down. "Coffee?" "Yes." "Thank you," Peter said, his voice gravelly, calm, black. Her hand paused slightly as she poured, then kept going. When she looked up, Peter was watching her carefully, not rudely, not even suspicious, just like he remembered something. Or someone. "Have we met before?" he asked, tone gentle but unmistakably direct. Amelia froze. The question struck harder than expected, not because of what he said, but because of what stirred inside her as he said it. Something cracked, not pain exactly, but the outline of a memory, hazy and weightless like fog curling across a lake. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped back, set the coffee pot down a little too quickly, and walked behind the counter. In the break room, she braced herself against the sink and stared at her reflection. She touched her face, her lips, her jaw, like the woman in the mirror wasn't her own. Her mouth moved. Why does he know me? She didn't wait for an answer. Outside. Alexander half rose from his seat, but Peter raised a hand to stop him. "Let her process," he said quietly. "Give her room." A few seconds passed. Then the door opened again. Zoe entered, wind-tossed, cheeks red from the brisk air. She walked toward the table without looking around, her backpack swinging behind her. Her face was pale with resolve. Alexander stood. "Zoe." She opened her backpack and pulled out a sheet of paper, wrinkled at the corners from being gripped too tightly. "This woman," she said, setting it on the table between them. "Her name is Isabel Montgomery, and I think she's my mother too." The cafe stopped breathing. Amelia stepped out of the back room just in time to hear the last sentence. Her hands were still damp from the sink. She stood behind Zoe, looking down at the picture now resting on the table. Her face, her pendant, her child. Her knees didn't buckle, but the color drained from her face, like water pouring from a cracked glass. Peter turned the paper slightly. "Where did you find this online?" Zoe replied. "She disappeared in 2011. Vermont. I matched the necklace, the eyes. Then I found this." She unfolded a second page. "This one, a faded scan of a missing persons report. I think my mom didn't just survive a crash. I think she used to be someone else." Amelia said nothing. She stepped back from the table, the quiet stretching taut between them like a cable about to snap. Alexander's voice broke through. "Isabel," he asked, barely more than a whisper. Amelia looked up, slowly, and for the first time, something in her expression shifted just slightly. Not a full recognition, but the beginning of one. She didn't look back, but everyone at that table knew something had changed. Peter Langford arrived at Brattleboro Memorial Hospital just before noon, parking beneath the rust-streaked signage that hadn't changed since the last time he stepped foot here 12 years ago. The cold wind whipped around the corner of the lot, but he ignored it, his focus locked on the battered brick building in front of him. He moved with urgency. Something inside him had shifted since the moment Zoe spoke that name aloud. Inside, the hospital smelled like age and antiseptic. Familiar. He asked the receptionist for Nora Halpern. "Retired," the young man said, without lifting his eyes. But when Peter handed over a worn business card and said, "I'm here about the 2011 admission, unknown female, April." The man paused and pointed toward the staff lounge. "She volunteers Tuesdays." Peter found her in the back, wiping down a counter. Nora looked up, eyebrows furrowing at the sight of him. "Langford," she murmured, then softened. "I figured I'd see you again someday." They didn't need small talk. She led him 3 flights up. Down a corridor, few visitors walked anymore. The records room was a windowless closet with a hum from the overhead light. She moved slowly but with purpose, sliding open a file drawer and pulling out a thick blue folder. "Didn't go digital until 2013, she explained, placing it into Peter's hands. This one stayed paper. Peter opened it gently. Unknown female. Admitted April 18th, 2011. Age estimate mid-30s. Found unconscious near Route 9 after landslide response. No photo, no fingerprints matched. The intake note was short. No ID. Amnesia suspected. Responsive. Refused photo documentation. Whispered name Tyler. Peter froze. He flipped through to the medication charts, dated scans, notes on head trauma. One CT image showed a faint dark area near the frontal lobe. Mild, but enough. Then a page with shaky handwriting. Patient keeps repeating, "Protect Tyler." He stood very still. She didn't forget. He whispered, "She was protecting someone." Nora nodded, her expression dim. She woke crying some nights, but always held on to that necklace like it was a piece of her spine. Outside, Peter stepped into the wind, pulled out his phone, and dialed Alexander. "I think she didn't disappear by accident," he said. "I think she chose to vanish." There was silence on the line. Meanwhile, back in Carter's Hearth Cafe, Zoe sat tucked into the storage room beside the bookshelf, her laptop balanced on her knees. On the screen was a news article clipped from an archive site, a black and white photo of a young couple, Alexander Montgomery and his wife Isabel, smiling beside a stroller. The headline read, "Real Estate Heir's Wife, Missing After Storm. Search Suspended." Zoe's eyes burned. She'd been chasing ghosts her whole life, but this one had a face and a name that matched the one her mother never spoke. The door creaked behind her. She spun, startled, but it was just the wind rattling through the back hallway. She exhaled shakily and closed the laptop. Outside the cafe, the snow had thickened. Amelia stood alone behind the restaurant, holding the necklace in her palm. Her fingers curled tightly around it. The name Isabel Montgomery rolled in her mind like a half-remembered song. "Why does that name feel like a wound?" she whispered. A crunch in the snow made her turn. Tyler. He stood just a few feet away, not in a rush, not demanding answers, just there. His voice was soft, but it carried weight. "Are you—" "My mom." Her lips parted, but nothing came, not yet. The snow outside Carter's Hearth Cafe had crusted into a still white sheet by midnight, inside the small apartment above the cafe. Amelia stirred in her sleep, face twitching, breath shallow. In her dream, the kitchen was flooded with golden morning light. Flour dusted the countertops. The smell, warm apple pie, cinnamon, and butter wrapped around her like an old song. A little boy stood at the edge of the counter, cheeks red, hands sticky, eyes wide with joy. He reached toward her, laughing, "Mom." She tried to step closer, but her feet felt anchored to the floor. A low wind blew through the window, scattering flour like ash. The boy's face blurred, faded. Her hand reached out, trembling, but he was gone. Amelia sat up in bed, heart pounding, sweat cooling on her neck. For a long moment, she couldn't move. The dream had the weight of something remembered, not imagined. She stood, walked barefoot across the cold wood floor to the dresser, and pulled open the bottom drawer. Inside, the wooden box waited. Her fingers hesitated at the latch, then flipped it open. She unfolded the worn paper again. Her eyes traced the familiar ink. "If you forget, they win. I am..." But this time, she noticed the faint writing below, once too faded to read. Under the fold, nearly erased. "If they erase you, they erase your son." The air left her lungs. For 12 years, she had built a life in Brattleboro. She had survived, raised Zoe, and poured herself into a rhythm of simplicity. But none of it explained the aching gap in her chest, the sense that something had been torn away, not lost. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, same hair, same quiet brown eyes, but something different in them tonight. A fight, a flicker, in Manhattan, hundreds of miles away. Alexander stepped into the boardroom of Montgomery Plaza. The skyline burned gold behind him, but his expression was cut from steel. Around the table sat senior staff, finance, PR, legal. At the far end, Victoria Sinclair sipped from her porcelain cup, face unreadable. He didn't open a folder, didn't look at notes. Where were you the night Isabel disappeared? The room fell into a heavy silence. A junior associate dropped his pen. Victoria didn't blink. "Excuse me. You were in Vermont that week," Alexander said. "At the time, you said it was a family emergency, but no one in your family was hospitalized. I checked." Her voice, when it came, was soft and crisp. "What exactly are you implying?" He leaned forward. That you knew more than you claimed. That you've known for years. Victoria sat straighter, the corners of her mouth tightening, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she calmly placed her cup down and folded her hands in her lap. I see, she said. He held her gaze. I'm going to find out the truth, and when I do, I won't protect anyone, not even you. Meanwhile, back in Vermont, Zoe lay awake in her room, staring at the ceiling. Her laptop still open beside her, the page frozen on an old news article, Wife of CEO, missing after storm. The photo was grainy, taken from a fundraiser a decade ago, but the curve of the cheek, the tilt of the smile, it was unmistakable. Her mother, or at least the woman she called mother now, in the quiet downstairs. Amelia stepped out onto the back porch. She wore only a sweater, the cold biting, but she didn't flinch. Her hand reached for the silver crescent moon pendant, now warm from her skin. The words came without thinking, whispered into the snow-heavy night. Why does that name feel like a wound? A soft sound behind her made her turn. Tyler stood there, bundled in his coat, eyes serious, scared, steady. Are you my mom? The box had been buried behind tax files and dusty folders, at the back of Peter Langford's storage unit in Queens. He hadn't touched it in over a decade, not since the Montgomery disappearance was shelved under the convenient label of presumed dead. But now, holding the box again, something in his chest tightened. His fingers hesitated before unlatching the old brass clasp. Inside were creased manila envelopes, faded notes scribbled on yellow legal pads, and old faxes from Brattleboro Memorial. Most of it was noise, but tucked beneath a sheet labeled Carter's Hearth Vicinity Map. Peter found something he didn't expect, a slim black external hard drive, labeled in handwriting he immediately recognized. For Alex, if I don't return. The handwriting was tight, nervous. The kind of hand that had written in the dark. Peter closed the box and drove straight to Bronx Digital Recovery. The technician there, a bearded kid with smudged glasses named Leo, gave the hard drive one skeptical glance. Vintage, he muttered, then added, but maybe not dead. It took 3 hours. At 3:42 p.m., Peter stood behind Leo, watching as a folder flickered to life on the screen. Log 2011, private. Inside were 12 video files, all date-stamped over a 10-day period in April 2011. The resolution was low, but the first frame of each video was unmistakable. Isabel Montgomery, sitting on a couch in a dim living room. In the first clip, she wore a hooded sweatshirt and clutched the crescent moon necklace in her fist like it was an anchor. Her voice was low, unsteady. If anyone finds this, I'm not sure who I am anymore. But I remember numbers. I remember how the books looked wrong. She paused. David said he would fix it, but that's not what he did. Peter leaned closer, in clip after clip. Isabel, no makeup. Tired eyes. Voice trembling, spoke of odd transactions. Funds vanishing from charity accounts tied to Montgomery real estate, and names she didn't trust. Victoria signed off on them, but when I asked questions, she told me I was confused. In one entry, she whispered, I think they're watching me. The fifth clip had her pacing the small living room. In the background, a toddler's toy lay on the floor. I left the office that day with copies. I never meant to run. But Tyler, he had a fever. I went home, and by morning, the files were gone. She paused then, staring into the camera. If something happens to me, tell Tyler I never stopped trying. Peter didn't realize how tight he'd been clenching his jaw until he exhaled. His hands shook as he copied the entire folder to a secure drive and mailed it overnight to Alexander Montgomery, back in Manhattan. Alexander opened the drive in his study at Montgomery Plaza. The room was dark, except for the desk lamp casting a golden pool across polished wood. He watched Isabel speak from the past, and time fractured. Every frame hit like a pulse in his ribs. He watched her explain the missing reports. He watched her whisper names he recognized from board meetings. He watched her beg, I need someone to believe me. When the final clip began, Isabel was visibly more worn, her face pale, her voice strained. She held the camera lower, hands trembling. The image was off-center. In the background, the front door opened. Footsteps, then a woman's voice, familiar and cold. "You should really stop recording." Victoria Sinclair walked across the frame. The clip cut to black. Alexander sat frozen. His palms had gone damp, resting on the carved edge of his desk. Outside, the city moved on. But inside, something had just ruptured. Something long buried had started clawing back up. He replayed the last 10 seconds again, and this time, he didn't blink. Windham County Courthouse was a modest building, aged brick, narrow windows, and a hallway that carried sound like a whisper in a cathedral. Amelia stood outside its main entrance for a long while, hands buried in the pockets of her wool coat, eyes tracing the fading letters on the carved stone arch. Zoe stood beside her, quiet but solid. Her presence the only steady thing Amelia felt that morning. Inside, Peter Langford had already arrived, papers tucked in a weathered briefcase. He nodded at the bailiff with the quiet familiarity of a man who'd spent his life in and out of courtrooms. At the other end of the aisle, Alexander Montgomery sat, arms stiff on the bench, his gaze flicking from the door to the table in front of him, where Tyler sat, chin lifted, hands clasped, waiting. The hallway echoed with the sound of Amelia's steps. Each footfall was deliberate, slow, as though her body was moving ahead of her memory. She didn't know what she expected: recognition, shock, denial, but what she got was something quieter. Every face turned to her not in alarm, but with a curious pause, as though they were each trying to place a shadow from a long-forgotten dream. Amelia's eyes landed on Tyler. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He simply stood and took a single step forward, his hand reaching slightly behind him to find Zoe's. The gesture undid her. The judge, a woman in her 60s with a steel-gray bob and a voice like dry gravel, opened the session with calm authority. "We're here today to hear a preliminary account of a disappearance that was never officially closed, and to determine whether formal proceedings are warranted." Peter rose and approached the bench. His voice was steady, stripped of any theatrical weight. He presented the external drive, the authentication documents, and a short summary of its origin. When he nodded to the technician in the back of the room, the lights dimmed, and a grainy video played on the overhead screen. Isabel appeared on screen, no makeup, eyes raw from sleeplessness. The same necklace, now hanging against Amelia's collarbone. She spoke of accounts and missing funds. She mentioned David, mentioned fear. She said the words "I didn't run" and Tyler, but it was the final clip, the one Peter had watched alone, that changed everything. Victoria Sinclair's voice cut through the footage like a blade. "You should really stop recording." A collective ripple moved through the room. Even the judge's pen paused mid-note. Victoria, sitting on the opposite side in a tailored navy suit, went pale. Her lips parted, but no words came. When she stood and tried to step out, the bailiff moved swiftly and blocked the door. "You'll remain until the session concludes." "Ms. Sinclair," the judge said without looking up. Alexander didn't turn toward her. He kept his eyes on Amelia. Peter stepped aside. And now it was Amelia's turn. She rose slowly, palms trembling, the air between her and the courtroom thick with the pressure of old wounds. She stepped forward, past the rail, and stood in the witness box. "I can't recall all the facts," she began, voice barely above a whisper. "But I remember the fear. I remember the night I thought I might lose everything. I remember someone warning me not to speak again. And I remember. I wasn't supposed to survive." No one moved. No one spoke. Alexander leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes locked on the woman who, after years of silence, had finally spoken. The judge looked at her for a long moment, then simply nodded. It wasn't over. Not yet. But something irreversible had begun. As Amelia stepped down, the courtroom still silent. Tyler stood again. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her. She didn't look away. The sky above Manhattan was black velvet stitched with cold stars. from the street. Montgomery Plaza glowed like a monolith glass and steel, swallowing the lights of a city that never asked where people went when they vanished. Peter and Amelia stood at the security desk in the lobby, flanked by silence and polished marble. The guard didn't ask questions when Peter flashed his credentials and handed over a temporary pass. The elevator hummed as it climbed to the 27th floor. Amelia didn't speak. Her reflection in the mirrored panels stared back with a stillness she hadn't felt in years. Not calm, not fear. Just a kind of hush inside her chest, as if the noise had all fallen away. When the doors opened, they stepped into the heart of something old and unfinished. Montgomery Real Estate's executive suite was dark, but not abandoned. The lights flicked on by motion, polished floors, a wall of family photographs behind glass. The gold lettering still on the main door, Isabel Montgomery, Strategic Affairs. Peter handed her something wrapped in a clear envelope, an ID card. It was faded, the edges worn. Her picture was younger, her smile practiced, her name in bold print. Amelia stared at it like it belonged to someone else until her fingers closed over it. The ridged surface against her thumb made something in her ribs tighten. Peter didn't say anything. He only stepped back, letting her walk ahead alone. The door opened with a soft click. The scent was faint but unmistakable. Lavender and old cedar. The drawers hadn't been moved. The desk chair was turned slightly to the left, the way she used to leave it when she'd step out for coffee. On the shelves, hard-bound ledgers, arranged by fiscal quarter. On the far table, a stack of unused Montgomery-branded stationery. She reached out, touching a glass paperweight on the corner of the desk. Her fingers brushed over the edge, her breath caught. That was the object she'd clenched the night she wrote the resignation letter she never sent. Images hit her in scattered frames. Victoria Sinclair pacing the room. David Sinclair, leaning in with that lawyer's charm, twisted into quiet threat. "You sign this," he'd said, tossing a thick folder onto the table. "And this all goes away. I found your name on the audit log," she had whispered. "You knew the funds were being redirected. You found nothing you can prove," Victoria had snapped. "But if you push this, Isabel, your husband will lose every contract he's ever held. And your son, he'll grow up thinking his mother abandoned him." Amelia leaned over the table now, palms flat. That line still echoed. After all these years, it hadn't dulled. Peter stepped inside. Quiet. "I think this is the place," he said, pulling out his laptop and connecting it to the projector still mounted in the ceiling. The last recording. "You should see it here." The screen on the far wall lit up, a clip loaded, and there it was, recorded shakily from a phone. The same room, the same table. David Sinclair's voice, less careful than usual, maybe after too much wine. "We'll say she's under stress," he muttered on video. "We take her upstate for a while. Keep her off grid. Public will move on. It's not like she had a real title. She's just the wife. Wife of the CEO. Victoria's voice cut in, cooler. "That's the story. She needed rest. And then she stayed gone." Amelia turned toward Peter, her mouth parted. She didn't lose her memory. Peter said softly, "They made her disappear." Amelia didn't cry. She stood in the center of that polished floor, staring at the place where her life had been rewritten by someone else's hands, and she realized the fog hadn't been in her head. It had been wrapped around her, carefully placed, like a net. She stepped away from the table and walked toward the window. From the 27th floor, Manhattan looked like another planet, and she understood now it wasn't just her they tried to erase. They tried to erase the part of her that fought back. She pressed her palm to the glass, behind her. Peter waited. She didn't look back, but he knew. Something had changed. The courtroom felt colder that morning, though no one could explain why. It wasn't the air conditioning or the marble floors. It was something in the way the sound moved, how footsteps echoed too long, how whispers stopped as soon as the doors creaked open. Victoria Sinclair walked in behind two attorneys dressed in gray. She wore navy, tailored sharply to remind the room of who she had always been, the woman behind the scenes, the keeper of balance sheets, the executor of quiet power. Her heels clicked with precision. Her chin was high, but the space around her felt brittle, like if someone spoke too loud, the whole facade would shatter. She sat at the defense table without a word. Across the aisle, Peter adjusted his tie and stood. The judge, an older man with a weary gaze, nodded for him to proceed. This was the second day of the hearing, but the tension made it feel like the first breath before a storm. Peter pulled a small recorder from his briefcase and spoke into the silence. "This audio file," he said, "was obtained through a retired financial auditor, Daniel Rhymes, who worked with Montgomery Real Estate until early 2012. It records a closed-door meeting held on March 9th, 2011, 1 month before Isabel Montgomery's disappearance." He pressed play. At first, the recording crackled with static. Then came the voices, David's, hurried and dismissive, Victoria's, calm and cutting, and then Rhymes himself, questioning a line-item discrepancy tied to a fund labeled Pine Circle Holdings. "No one will believe a woman who disappeared conveniently right before audit season." Victoria's voice said, steady, cold, almost rehearsed. The courtroom didn't gasp. No one moved. It was a silence that drew itself taut, one that held its breath with every syllable. Alexander sat in the gallery, hands locked tight together, his knuckles pale. His jaw worked back and forth slowly, like he was grinding away the words he wanted to say. Behind his eyes, something crumbled across the aisle. Victoria didn't flinch, but her mouth was a fraction too tight, her shoulders too straight. The judge turned to her counsel. "Your client has now been directly implicated in obstructing an internal investigation and intimidating a whistleblower. Do you wish to respond?" One of her attorneys leaned in and whispered, but Victoria didn't move. Behind them, Amelia sat with her back straight, arms resting gently in her lap. She wore no makeup today. Her eyes weren't sharp, but they were clear, like the fog that had haunted her for over a decade had finally lifted. When Victoria turned, just once, their eyes met. Amelia didn't look away. And for the first time, Victoria blinked. Zoe reached across the bench, taking Tyler's hand. Her voice was a whisper against his shoulder. She remembers now. Tyler nodded, but he didn't speak. His gaze stayed on his mother. Peter stepped away from the stand and turned toward the clerk. "We are submitting this file along with its transcript as part of formal evidence." The judge nodded once, heavy, deliberate. Then a court officer stepped up to the bench, handed the judge a printed note, and retreated quickly. The judge frowned. He looked up. "It appears we have a formal request submitted to this court moments ago. A Mr. David Sinclair has filed an affidavit requesting permission to testify in these proceedings." Heads turned. Peter stiffened. Alexander looked up sharply. Amelia's lips parted just slightly, a breath caught between surprise and disbelief. The judge adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Sinclair states the reason for his voluntary testimony is, quote, 'I need to protect my son before everything burns.'" A stillness fell over the courtroom again, but this time it wasn't cold. It was waiting. The room was packed tighter than any day prior. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Windham County Courthouse, casting long beams across rows of quiet faces. But all eyes fixed forward when the side door opened and David Sinclair stepped in. He looked nothing like the photographs that once graced business journals and investor galas. His suit hung too loose, his cheeks sunken. A few strands of silver hair fell across his forehead. He held no briefcase, only a manila folder clutched to his chest and a small red USB drive in his other hand. When he took the stand, there was no fanfare, no lawyer by his side. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Sinclair, are you represented by counsel?" David shook his head slowly. "No, Your Honor. I'm here not as a defendant. Not yet. I'm here because I can't carry it anymore." The courtroom went still. He leaned forward into the microphone. "Years ago, I made a decision that shifted everything. Montgomery Real Estate was hemorrhaging money from a side fund meant for low-income housing. We misappropriated over $9 million. When Isabel discovered the audit trail, she refused to stay quiet. She said she'd report it even if it meant bringing down the family name." He paused, letting the silence stretch. The judge didn't interrupt. Neither did Peter. I told her we'd handle it. David continued. But Victoria had other ideas. She arranged a trip, a temporary disappearance, just until things cooled down. It was supposed to be 2 weeks, maybe a month. But when Isabel got into that car, she didn't come back the same. Not because of an accident, but because we made her believe she couldn't come back. David's hand trembled as he held up the flash drive. This contains the original investment reports, email threads, and voice memos I never meant to keep but did. And the final confession I recorded last month. It names us both, me and Victoria. It's all in here. Peter stood to collect the drive, but paused when David turned toward the gallery. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on her. Amelia Carter is not a new person, he said, voice barely above a whisper. She is Isabel. And I was the one who made her forget by making her afraid to remember. Amelia didn't flinch. She didn't cry. But something in her posture shifted a long-held breath. Released. A weight sliding off unseen shoulders. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her chair, knuckles white. Zoe reached for her hand, but didn't say anything. Tyler, next to her, didn't look away from David. The older man turned to Alexander next. I thought I was protecting the legacy, David said, but I destroyed a family. Alexander's jaw worked as if trying to contain something behind his teeth. He stood slowly, not out of anger, but something closer to reverence, or grief, and walked to Amelia. Without a word, he placed a hand on her shoulder light, steady, and that was the moment it shifted. Not when David confessed, not when the USB was entered into evidence, but when Alexander stood beside the woman once known only by a new name and said without speaking that he still saw her. The judge cleared his throat, voice quieter than before. This court hereby motions to open a formal case against Victoria Sinclair and David Sinclair under counts of financial fraud, obstruction of justice, and unlawful manipulation of personal identity. He looked at Amelia, and we will also reinstate the legal proceedings to restore the identity and rights of Isabel Montgomery. Somewhere behind her, someone gasped softly, but in the front row, she just nodded. One small motion. Enough. As David was escorted from the stand, he didn't resist. He didn't speak. And Amelia, finally, allowed her shoulders to drop, not in defeat, but in release. The sun hit the glass facade of Midtown Civic Hall just before noon. A warm breeze stirred the flags lining the plaza. Inside, chairs were neatly aligned. The podium stood silent under soft white light, and on every seat, a folded program bore a new name in bold letters, Montgomery and Carter, building with truth. Amelia sat in the front row, Tyler on her right, Zoe to her left. Alexander stood just behind them, arms folded loosely, his gaze steady. The room wasn't filled with investors or executives. It held former employees, auditors, interns who once walked on eggshells through the old Montgomery building, their names lost in the folds of power. Now, they were being remembered. When her name was called, Amelia rose. She walked slowly to the stage, not because she lacked strength, but because each step meant something. Years of silence behind hospital curtains. Years of names she didn't recognize. Truths too fractured to hold on to. She carried them all up those steps. She reached the podium, rested her fingers on the sides. A hush fell. She looked across the room and saw not faces, but echoes of who she'd once been. The girl who agreed to stay quiet. The woman who vanished. The mother who forgot, not by accident, but by fear. She looked down at the microphone. Then she set it aside. She didn't speak. Instead, she turned toward the audience and held their eyes. Not as Amelia Carter, not as a victim, but as someone who had walked through the wreckage and decided to come back with her own name. Zoe stood quietly as Amelia stepped off the stage. The girl didn't ask anything, just reached up and took her hand. Tyler rose too, unsure for a second, then steadied himself. He offered his other hand, and she took his, too. The three of them walked side by side down the central aisle, past rows of people who didn't clap, Didn't speak, but watched with something heavier than applause, something quieter than admiration. Respect. At the back of the hall, the glass doors opened automatically as they approached. Afternoon sunlight spilled in. The city outside didn't pause, didn't know it had just witnessed a different kind of victory. Alexander followed a few steps behind, not leading, not guiding, just there. A young reporter near the exit caught up, voice gentle but persistent. "Mrs. Montgomery, will you be returning to the company now that your name's been cleared?" Amelia turned toward him. She didn't hesitate. "No. I have something more important to rebuild." Behind them. The new logo flickered alive on the digital marquee. The old shield and columns were gone. In their place, clean lines, a softened typeface, Montgomery and Carter. No longer just a name, but a truth returned. She didn't look back, but he knew. Something had changed. The breeze outside the courtroom smelled faintly of old brick and morning rain, like the city was exhaling after holding its breath too long. She didn't look different, but something about the way she stood, not waiting for permission, felt like a kind of arrival. No declarations, no final words, just a stillness that made space for whatever came next. Maybe healing isn't about fixing what was broken, but about letting it breathe. And maybe some truths don't need to be shouted, just quietly lived.